Texas is full of all kinds of abandoned buildings and structures. Some of these include crumbling churches and temples that have been frozen in time and forgotten by society. All of them have stories to tell us. Some of them are fascinating, well-documented stories, while others are ominously shrouded in mystery. Join me as I step into the unknown and explore the top 5 abandoned churches and temples in Texas. Number 5. Unknown derelict church at Fowlerton, Texas. This overgrown church at Fowlerton, Texas has a nice mix of history and mystery. There's plenty of information on the rise and fall of Fowlerton, which is the ghost town where this church is located. However, I was unable to find much information at all on the history of this dilapidated church itself. The ghost town of Fowlerton, Texas is named for 2 brothers who settled the community around 1910. By 1914, Fowlerton had peaked in population at around 1,000 and had telephone service. However, farmers faced serious challenges to their livelihoods, including droughts and low prices. By 1925, the population had declined to about 600, and it never recovered. As the town imploded, a gradual exodus took place, and most of the town's businesses and homes, as well as this church, ended up abandoned. Most likely, the church was built around the same time as the rest of the town, which would have been around the early 1900s, but of course, there's no way to tell for sure. Now, the only parishioners attending this church are the snakes, birds, and insects that inhabit this portion of the wild Texas desert. Number 4. Abandoned Zion Hill Church at Caldwell, Texas. Welcome to a place of mystery. This is a remote church located far from any major cities, and it's falling apart. Google Maps labels it as the Zion Hill Church, but there's not much more information than that available online. It's technically located within the city limits of the town of Caldwell, Texas, which was founded in the mid-1800s. So it's entirely possible that these crumbling church ruins could hail from the early 1900s, or even the late 1800s, although based on the interior appearance of the church, it was probably only abandoned a few short decades ago. The inside of the church is still furnished, decorated, and well stocked with presumably original items, although in complete disarray. There's a furnished stage, chairs, religious books littering the floor, and even a couple of cute, furry attendants that greeted us as we came in. The floor, the roof, and the walls were all rotting and could all collapse at any moment. I was positively surprised to see that the church bell, although very dirty and worn, was still present and recognizable on top of the church, where generations of birds have most likely been nesting and raising their young for decades. Truly, exploring this place was like stepping back in time, although I must admit that we actually left the site with more questions than answers. The secrets of this place will have to remain where they are for now, shrouded in mystery and lurking in the darkness, crushed under the cumulative weight of the passing years, decades, and possibly centuries. Number 3. Crumbling St. Dominics Church at D'Hanis, Texas. Deep in central Texas, near the town of D'Hanis, lie the mythical ruins of the old Church of St. Dominic. Although the crumbling structure of this church has no doubt seen better days, efforts are now being made to preserve it, and rightly so. This colonial church dates back to the mid-1800s, and over the years it has become an integral part of the history of D'Hanis, Texas. The town of D'Hanis was founded in 1847, and it was initially inhabited by just a few dozen families in mesquite shacks. As the town grew, the shacks were replaced by European-style stone buildings. Before long, the addition of a post office and a schoolhouse made it a real town. Shortly thereafter, the Church of St. Dominic was built, and priests from another settlement would travel there to hold mass. However, the town of D'Hanis soon found itself in a bit of a predicament. It had been passed over by the railroad. This was bad for the economy. Thus, when the newly laid tracks skipped over D'Hanis, residents just picked up and moved closer to the tracks. The relatively newer town of D'Hanis is just 1.5 miles away from the original, centered around a railroad depot. However, churchgoers still continued to attend Mass at St. Dominic's Church and the old portion of the town for several years, right up until a fire ravaged this original church building in 1912. In 1915, a new church was built closer to town, and these ruins, the remains of the original St. Dominic's Church, were left behind. As a matter of fact, there's not much left at all of the old original town of D'Hanis other than the ruins of this church and its cemetery, which is part of what makes this place so significant. The ruins of St. Dominic Catholic Church and the D'Hanis Cemetery are now part of the D'Hanis Historic District, and the district was added to the National Register of Historic Places on June 24, 1976. Number 2. Palace of the Golden Orbs in Houston, Texas. On the western suburbs of Houston, Texas, an enormous white temple topped with a giant golden sphere emerges from the surrounding buildings and seems to tower towards the very heavens. It almost looks like something straight out of a fantasy or science fiction movie. This peculiar abandoned structure, known by some as the Palace of the Golden Orbs and by others as Chonghua Sheng Mu Holy Palace, is a nearly completed Taoist palace that was discontinued after its creator was deported before her ambitious plans could be realized. The palace was the life's work of Kwai Fun Wong, the leader of a Chinese Taoist organization who envisioned a grand Taoist complex of multiple buildings which were to offer worship, daycare, retail, and residential living. To pursue this vision, she purchased 11 acres of land in 1999 and began constructing its palatial centerpiece. Unfortunately, Kwai Fun Wong's work was abruptly interrupted in 2001 when she was deported for failing to solidify permanent residency, permanently ending all construction of the palace. Since then, no one's bothered to tear the temple down. Instead, it sits and waits in loneliness and silent agony, a monument to shattered dreams, broken spirits, and unfulfilled expectations. A chapel for the could-haves and the would-haves. A shrine to blood, sweat, and tears, sinking into the ground in cold, cruel futility. Number 1. Abandoned church at Beau, Texas. Deep in the middle of a vast, sparsely populated desert in northern Texas lie the mystical remains of a grand red brick church building that hails from the early 1900s. Its congregation was established in 1908, when services and masses would usually be held in Mary's Creek Schoolhouse or in the home of a Matt Merrick. The first church building, now completely gone, was built in 1909, while this specific red brick church was built in 1936. Although not too much more information on this church building is publicly available, it's surrounded by what few structures remain of the old rural community of Beau, Texas, which is now a ghost town. Little is known about the town's namesake, W.T. Bomer, except that he was one of the area's earliest residents. The town of Beau was never a large community, with the population peaking at 600 in the early 1900s. During and after World War II, Beau population began to decline. The population was recorded as 150 in 1960, 27 in 1980, and 15 in 2000. By this point, the entire town has faded away almost entirely. Many of the ghost town's original buildings are now gone, with this beautifully constructed red brick church building being one of the few exceptions. It's places like these that serve as portals to the past, allowing us to travel back in time, so to speak, and visualize these communities as they once were years, decades, or even centuries ago. Abandoned historical relics like this one are almost the only thing that protects the stories, struggles, and achievements of the early Texas settlers from fading completely into oblivion, by instead memorializing them, that they may be remembered by ourselves, our children, and our children's children for many years to come. Thank you so much for coming along and traveling back in time with me to these amazing abandoned historical places. Keep in mind that these are not all of the abandoned churches and temples that are found in Texas, just my favorite 5, based on whether they're truly abandoned, how old they are, the history behind them, accessibility, and their current condition. Do you feel like I missed something? Please feel free to comment below the video. In addition, I would like to give special thanks to Explore with Rick, the intrepid explorer and YouTuber himself, for allowing me to use some of his amazing pictures for this compilation. You can find a link to his channel in the description below the video. Again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on my next adventure.